I'm Billy Hollowell, host of CBN's new documentary investigating the supernatural miracles. Now, the interview that you're about to watch details an incredible miracle story, but I want to briefly talk about our film, which tells different stories that will deeply challenge you, inspire you, and get you thinking deeper about evidence for the supernatural. Before we air today's interview, please check out this 60-second trailer for investigating the supernatural miracles. You can head on over to cbn.com/supernatural to watch the film. Here's the trailer.
I got out of my patrol car and I slipped.
I went from having a promising career as a neuroscientist to having a medical death sentence.
I said there was nothing else that we could do. There was no heartbeat.
Time of death, 8:05.
Are miracles real? Do they happen today? Let's investigate.
A lot of skeptics will say, well, miracles are impossible. Why? Because they violate the laws of nature. You can't violate the laws of nature.
People would pray for me, and sometimes it felt like this power that just zapped me.
When I woke up, she says, "Can you do anything that you didn't do before?" I looked at my hand that was clutched. I said, "Hand, move."
He's dead. It's over. I said, shock him one more time.
Well, maybe it happens, maybe it doesn't. Let's look at the evidence.
And here is today's interview, which we hope will deeply inspire you. Well, I'm so excited to be able to sit down with you. You have an incredible book, Anticipating Heaven, Spiritual Comfort and Practical Wisdom for Life's Final Chapters. We're going to get into the book and why you wrote it in a moment. But I have to ask you, you are a physician, you're a doctor, and you're also a very strong Christian believer. Is there a conflict between those things in your view? Have you experienced conflict between them?
Absolutely not. And I will say that I began my career as a doctor in 1989, and I was not a believer. In fact, had not been in church, knew nothing about Jesus other than he was Santa Claus, and in my mind. And my husband had grown up in the church, but had a few bad experiences, never had a personal relationship. So neither one of us were believers when we got married. And so beginning my practice in medicine, which has all been in hospitals or in Rwanda, I saw so many things, acute cases, tragedies, accidents that I didn't have a solution for. And so as a physician, it was discouraging, especially as a young physician. I had some really tragic cases early on, and one of them is written about in the book. But in my mid-30s, 2 years after Jesus chased my husband down, and he was saved in an event where he was unconscious from blood loss, and he experienced or saw life and death without Christ. He remembered the scripture from his youth, every knee will bow, every tongue confess, every knee will bow, and just cried out to the Lord, please give me another chance. And I was in the ambulance at the time. He was unconscious, and I didn't think he would survive. But Jesus did save him, both physically and spiritually. And when he
was that like a near death? Was that like a near death experience for him in that moment?
Yes.
So he experienced as he's having this blood loss, he's in the ambulance, he's unconscious, you're with him, but he's having this experience. Was it a heaven? Now I'm actually very curious about it because I didn't know this part of your story.
It was not seeing the light. It was seeing a cold darkness. But for him, what it felt like is awareness of his existence. And, he didn't describe it as his soul, but really, in reflection, it was his soul, and it was being pulled from him. And he knew that it was eternal death. He knew that, from all the things he'd heard in the good old Southern Baptist church, and it was actually true. And so he really did beg the Lord, and I think Jesus gave him that taste of death because it became so much of our story way down the line, um, because our testimony, our stories are so powerful. And the reality is, when he recovered enough to be able to kind of relate this experience to me, and he was this transformed person, I wasn't very happy. You know?
I was just going to say, I mean, here you are, you're a doctor, you're not a believer. He comes out of this near-death experience and he's like, I'm going to love Jesus now. And you're probably thinking, who are you?
I was so, like, sure that he'd had some kind of neurologic event due to low blood flow. I mean, I made him go get tested at a university, neuropsychological testing. Of course, it all came back normal. Um, he was reading the Bible, kind of hiding from me because I had a lot of anger then. It's kind of a little bit of what I grew up with, and I didn't understand. You know, all I knew is my wild and crazy fun guy I had met 2 years previously didn't want to go dancing anymore. um, and he prayed for me for 2 years, and we had a miracle in our life during that time. I still didn't believe, but Jesus doesn't give up on us, and he definitely doesn't give up when our spouse is praying for us, and parents are praying for their children.
So you're continuing to work as a doctor. He's praying for you. What was the moment for you that made you say, this skepticism that I have? Would you have considered yourself a skeptic, an atheist, an agnostic? What was sort of your
I was
framing at
like,
that time?
I don't even care if it's not on my, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Growing up, I was, at the bottom. How do we eat? How do we, do the basics? So it never really entered my thought. And then in medicine, you know, all the training, you're just on a sprint. And it felt like that working in the hospital. So I didn't really think much about it. But on one of these times when I was really angry at him, he said, I don't care what you say to me, and I don't care what you do to me. I will always love you, and I will never leave you. And for me, that was the first time that I was like, wow, I didn't know men had that capability. I felt really unlovable at my core. And a month later, we were in Grand Cayman, and he was out on a dive. I was looking for something to read. I was by myself, and he had a book in his bag there. I was like, it's called God of My Father, a little book. And I thought, I'll just read this. It was written by Larry Crabb, who I didn't know at the time he was a famous writer. But I did know the father, and the reason Scott had the book was he lived 15 minutes away from where we live, and that's why I had the book. And I read the book, and it was about this father's faith, and through the worst of tragedies, it was like a Job story, but his father having peace throughout the entire experience of losing a child, losing his spouse, aging. And I realized at that moment was such an intense sense of I've never had peace. I always felt
Wow.
like I had a stormy heart. And I just got on my knees by myself and I just cried out, Lord, I'm sorry for all the things I said to you. And I'm sorry
Wow.
for believing in you. And I just begged him for just a little bit of his peace. And Billy, it felt like a rain shower. And it still like shakes me when I realize that Jesus loved even me. And
Wow.
the thing about, maybe that later in life conversion, kind of a Saul Paul experience, I really dedicated my life and have dedicated my life to sharing him in every way I could. And I realized when I went back to work that, I had this great gift of medicine that I could do only so much with, but the gift of Jesus always was a miracle. And even if someone experiences a miracle, they still die. Death's 100%
Right.
fatal.
Even Lazarus, right. Even
And
Lazarus died again. Right. I mean, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I have to
so,
ask you this just because as you're saying this, and I don't mean to interrupt, but I have to, because you come in, you have this perspective, you're a doctor, you're working, this happens with your husband, and then you're thrown into this. You have this peace suddenly that you've gotten, you become a Christian, you go back to work. Once you're a Christian, how did it change the way that you practice and saw medicine specifically?
well, I saw medicine as what it is. It's a limited. It has a limited ability, um, and I was never concerned about rules of what do you say to patients, but I actually did it all wrong for many years, and I did it all wrong in that I'd you know ask, well, how do you share the gospel? And I would take notes of like who I shared it with, what their response was, which I got. Everybody went through the Romans road. Um, and, it really wasn't very effective. I called it my Gestapo gospel years. But, the thing about it is Jesus knew my heart and, and knew that I was willing to do anything for him. So he made me suffer. He made me suffer in such an intense way that I finally put down all of my identity and placed it fully in Him and understood I'm not saving someone, it's the Holy Spirit that saves them. I'm
It's
not
not on
having to
you.
say the
It's not
prayer.
your responsibility. It's right.
I'm
It's
not
God.
walking them across the finish line, but I am responsible for listening to the Spirit and saying what the Spirit says. And Jesus made it really clear. He brought me to Rwanda then. That was 2009. And, you know, I just, every time I go into a patient's room, like I just say a silent prayer, Lord, give me the words to say or
Wow.
how to pray. And then sometimes Jesus says, this one, you just stand there, I'm going to do everything. And I do that, like, not just as a doctor with patients. Patients it's a powerful opportunity because they're needing hope, but everybody needs hope. The grocery store
Everyone.
clerk, everybody needs hope. And I've never been turned down for prayer, even those I know by their dress don't believe as I do, but they still need hope and love. And those are the things that I begin with. And it's been a really fruitful season.
So, and I want to get into the book in a moment, but you and I, we met at a conference not that long ago, and I asked you this, and I'm going to ask it to you now. I was asking you personally, now I want to ask you this because as a doctor, and I'd be curious, even as a skeptical or agnostic, I guess, which apathetic, where you were before you were a Christian, and now being a Christian, did you encounter what you would now describe before becoming a Christian as miracles, things you couldn't explain as a doctor? And how have you processed seeing those things in your work since becoming a Christian even?
Yes, I saw things I couldn't explain um, as a physician, both as a non believer and as a believer. in non-believing patients and believing patients. As a mother of a son who was born blind, and um, after an incredible experience at a church that my husband dragged me to because I didn't want to go. But we were called to the front, and it was just a typical Southern Baptist church, and they just called for people to pray for us. And we had gone home that day, and when we first found out he was blind, we tried, we're like, no, surely he sees something. And so we would put all, flashing lights, all balloons, fire. And he
How old
never
was he when you found
able
that out?
to
How old
focus.
was he a baby when you found
He was
that
2
out?
months. Yeah.
Wow.
And what we thought, and I feel terrible to not know this, but he had nystagmus, which is that wandering of the eyes because there's nothing to focus on. And we just thought he was a really attentive, watching everything baby. And it was a really hard experience for a good friend who was our pediatrician having to tell us that he was blind. And so that particular day after church which was about 6 months later, after we'd gone to MUSC, a university in South Carolina, to Duke, and really didn't have any answers. On this particular day, my husband was changing his diaper after church and wearing a tie and had stripes on it. And when he threw the tie over his shoulder, our son, with his little wobbly head, looked at it. And my husband caught, come. And it was unreal. And as a non-believer, then I'm like, well, it has to be, there's a medical explanation for this. Which it wasn't even till it was much later that I look back and go, well, it had to have been a miracle. But the doctors, they didn't have an explanation for it. I couldn't place the two together. And through the years, I've seen other miracles, both in Rwanda and here. But Billy, this is the thing that's been hard as a clinician and someone of faith is I know the most amazing prayer warriors praying with complete faith that they or a loved one would be healed, and yet they weren't. And then I've seen, the miracle occur that, as far as I knew, there was no prayer behind that miracle. And it's been a really processing experience. And I started thinking, if we're choosing miracles on faith and really potential, it would be the young child with leukemia that prays faithfully as a child does, that they would be saved. And we know they're not.
That's the challenge, right? It's
so much the challenge. And I really have described miracles as God's gift. They're each a snowflake. He has a meaning entirely unique. He has a special purpose for them. We're to pray in faith because that helps us regardless of the outcome. Prayer does work in that way, but it doesn't.
And it's trust. It's that death to self and that trust. You're turning yourself over to say, I believe this miracle is possible. I'll believe it till the moment I die. But yes. I also have to trust that no matter what happens, that God has a plan, and I have to rest in that. And those two things are very hard for human beings to do at the same time. And you see that you see that every day, I'm sure.
My theology is God is good and I trust him. and it's very simple. And it's just, years and years of like having to see suffering and living through suffering, but then always loving God and trusting Him with outcomes. And many times I'll get asked, well, how do you know about what happens after your last breath? I mean, I know these near death experiences and all that, but how do you know? And I say, it's the evidence. And they're thinking I'm going to go into apologetics or, you know, some other explainable reason, but it's really the evidence of who He's been in my personal life and the things that have happened that are statistically impossible without Him.
That brings me to the book. But before we get into anticipating heaven, when it comes to your son and, you weren't a believer at that time, your husband dragged you to the church and you went up and prayed. Do you think it was the prayer? What do you think it was that, and of course it's more complex than that, but do you think the prayer that happened in that church helped pave the way for that healing of the blindness?
I mean, sure. Yeah. Why wouldn't I believe that? Um, I know that, even though I tried to explain it away as a non spiritual thing, it cemented my husband's faith in a way that um, lives today. And even in our
Wow.
son's, he's now a computer engineer using his eyes all the time.
And never had problems with vision severely after that?
Interestingly, so were followed by Duke for many years, and he was always around 2,400. Yeah, and it wasn't correctable with glasses. It was um, described as a brain issue processing. And so, he had large print books and sat at the front of the class, but we were just grateful for what he had, and he didn't know any different. He was not good at uh, pee-wee baseball, but he had a loving normal life until he became aware of this is going to prevent me from being able to drive, and he truly began praying for himself. We didn't know this, but it was really, he'd also gone to Rwanda. He was a sophomore in high school at that point, and just started praying for that specific prayer. And on one Wednesday night service, my husband was one of the elders at the time. They were standing at the front of the church, just asking, if anybody wanted to come up for prayer. And my son gets up and goes and kneels in front of my husband and just says, "Would you pray for me, Dad, that my vision will get better?" And we went back to Duke about, when it was time to get checked. We didn't rush back. But he was 2070, which was just at the border of being able to drive. And now he's 2040. But he gets, and he's living in that, own sense of his own miracle,
Wow.
something he prayed for. And he is just such a powerful believer.
Wow.
We've
Wow.
also
I mean,
talked about the other side. He's had friends die and unexpected consequences. So um, he
that's the
understands.
challenge. We have to be honest about miracles when we talk about them too, right? We have that not everybody gets the miracle on this side of eternity. Not Lazarus died again. As we said, this is, we have to have that balance, but it's incredible that you had multiple miracles that all required belief from each of you in an interesting way when it
Yes.
comes to his vision. And that brings me to your latest book, Anticipating Heaven: Spiritual Comfort and Practical Wisdom for Life's Final Chapters, because this is an important book, dealing with the end of life and what comes next. Why did you want to write this particular book?
It was a patient that told me on the day before what was going to be her death. She didn't know it was going to be the next day, but we knew it was imminent. And she was just wanting, understanding of what to expect and what her family would see. And as I'm talking to her, I'm sitting on the side of her hospital bed, and I realized how much I was going to miss her. And I'm just, someone who she saw when she came to the hospital. And I just thought of her family and I began to cry. And she very lovingly and with great peace and confidence said, "It's okay. It will be a good death." And I knew, as I know in most cases like that, she was confident of her destination. But that phrase God used in my own life to really help me explore my own mortality, because we often go through life. It happens to patients, it happens to other people, but we don't think about it in the context of our own lives. And the more I understood death, the more it brought clarity to life. And I realized that I wanted to write a book using my experience. And it's not a book just about dying. It's like when you first get a diagnosis, and no matter your faith, where you are, if it's a significant diagnosis, maybe not even terminal, you feel fear and chaos. And a lot of that is you don't know what to expect. And so I really walk someone in the journey from their first diagnosis. These are the questions to ask. This is how to get multiple opinions, what to expect at the hospital, how to plan for the unexpected and the expected, and then all the way through their ending. And I call it a book about the gospel, uniquely disguised as a medical resource book. And Billy, the thing is, I never could have imagined how much it would affect people's lives. And that's what kind of gives me lift now is I hear from patients. I get emails, people contact me through my website, and they tell the story of how the book impacted them or how they were able to care for a loved one because of it.
When you, and you sort of said it there, but at the end of the day, when all is said and done, what are you hoping that people are thinking and feeling? What do you want that big impact on the individual heart to be after they read Anticipating Heaven?
That we can have hope, and hope is one of the most powerful emotions to walk us through life, and we can anticipate it daily, even when we're not sick. I mean, if we live with hope and anticipation of God's presence, He shows up in really amazing ways. But it also helps us when we go through the hard times and understanding that our ability to hope today and our ability to know that we can hope for tomorrow and our eternity, it changes everything.
Absolutely. Well, where can people go if they want to learn more about you, your work? You have an incredible career, obviously, and you have this book and you have other projects coming. Where can people go to learn more?
drpamela.com. So drpamela.com.
Thank you so much for coming on. And
there.
yeah, I so appreciate you sharing, your personal stories, the miracles, your journey, the book. Again, it's Anticipating Heaven. People can get that wherever books are sold. Really appreciate your time today.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much.